bikes require maintenance to keep them working, so as a new rider you might be wondering, what maintenance does a dirt bike require? Welcome to the first ride. Of course, it will take you from just wanting to get into dirt bikes to your very first ride, and it's all 100% free here on YouTube. The most common piece of maintenance that I do on my dirt bike is bleeding the forks. Bleeding the forks is just cracking the bleeder screws at the top of the forks to let out excess air. As you ride, air gets built up in the forks and causes them to feel delayed and not perform as well. So, by keeping your forks bled, they will always perform well when you ride. I've made it a habit to bleed the forks before every ride. How often you bleed the forks just depends on how aggressive the riding is and how long you ride for. For example, if you ride on a very smooth, flat area, then the forks won't need to be bled as often. But if you ride somewhere where the riding conditions are very rough and the forks are being compressed a lot, then you'll need to bleed them more often. The same goes for how long you ride. If you ride for 1 hour at a time, then you can get away with bleeding the forks every other ride. But if you ride for 4 hours at a time, then you can bleed them before every ride. Keeping the forks compressed by tie downs on a long drive can also cause the forks to need to be bled along with elevation changes. The next piece of maintenance on a dirt bike is changing oil. After so long, the oil becomes dirty and full of metal shavings, so you need to replace it with fresh oil. There are two types of oil on a dirt bike: engine oil and transmission oil, and if you ride a two-stroke, then the engine oil is mixed in with the gas, so it doesn't need to be changed. I like to change my oil every 10 to 15 hours. Air needs to be sucked into the engine, and in order to avoid dirt from getting sucked into the engine, you have an air filter. After so long, that filter gets dirty and will need to be cleaned and re-oiled so that dirt doesn't get sucked through the filter. How often the filter needs to be cleaned and re-oiled depends on your riding conditions. For example, if where you ride the dirt is moist and hard-packed, then it won't need to be cleaned and re-oiled that often. But if where you ride the dirt is very dry, sandy, and just loose, then it'll need to be cleaned and re-oiled more often. As far as when you clean it, it's not a measure of hours, it's just a measure of looking at it and seeing how dirty it is. For example, this filter right here, I probably let go a little bit too long, so ideally I would take it out and clean it before it gets quite this dirty, but in all honesty, this still had a while before it was going to start sucking dirt into the engine. The next piece of maintenance on a dirt bike is adjusting the chain. After so long, the chain will stretch, but instead of replacing it, you can actually just push the axle back using adjusters. How hard and how aggressive you ride will determine how quickly that chain will stretch, and how you measure when it needs to be adjusted is fitting 3 fingers between the swing arm and the chain slider. Once that measurement has been exceeded, I adjust the chain. This piece of maintenance is a little bit less talked about, but it is checking bolts that often come loose and tightening them. The bolts that I've found that often come loose is exhaust mount bolts, the shift lever bolt, bolts that hold on the sprocket, and the bolt that holds on the kickstart. What bolts need to be adjusted will just depend on what type of bike it is, and after so long of riding, you'll know what bolts often come loose and what ones don't. I usually tighten these bolts about every other week, and I check them with my fingers to see if they're really loose before every ride. Rebuilds is more of a long-term piece of maintenance. Eventually, parts in the engine will become wore out and need to be rebuilt. I rebuild my top end every 100 to 150 hours, and my bottom end made it 600 hours before needing to be rebuilt. How long these parts last will just require on how hard and aggressive the bike is ridden and how well and often it is maintained. There will also be other rebuilds required, such as clutch, bearings, and seals. Every bike is going to vary on how average certain parts last, so first check your owner's manual, and more reliably, just go on Google and search your bike and see what other people are getting out of their machines. That'll give you a good idea. And that is all the maintenance that a dirt bike requires. I know I myself, when I first started riding, was intimidated by maintenance due to the fact that I had zero experience as a mechanic, but I've realized that it's not scary. It's actually really easy and enjoyable. And I also talked about all the what to do. I didn't explain how to do it. All the how to on bike mechanics will be explained in an upcoming course.